Okay, few things. One is, don't forget that the review session is going to be tomorrow, and it's going to be in lane 125, and your guys will be from 6 to 7:15, so sort of keep that in mind. Second is, there's going to be a small business seminar that it's going to be during winter break. And if you want to sign up for that, it runs from December 13th through December 17th from 8:30 in the a.m. It says 8:30 a.m. to 9 p.m. And then students will then present their business plan to the course instructors. It's going to be only $999 for 3 credits. So if you're interested in doing that, you should talk to Deanna Mackey, because she's in charge of she's the accounting prof, and she's in charge of the small business seminar. So anyway, if you want to pick up an extra 3 credits in, basically you're going to learn how to start a business. It says ability to learn about marketing, management, finance, human resources, and tax law in one course. And you take a small business idea of your own choosing and learn how to prepare a business plan, etc. So if you're interested at all in picking up an extra 3 credits over the break, it's like I said, it's going to be December 13th through the 17th, basically all day, and talk to Professor Mackey about that. Okay. I thought what I would do is I would go ahead and give you some of the questions that are going to be on the exam, like we did last time. That seemed to work out fairly well. First of all, I'm going to ask you to one of the essay questions, and I'm probably going to do 3 10-point essay questions and 2 short essay questions, 2 5-pointers. So let me just give you the first 10-point question. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to explain either ranked choice voting and just yesterday, the city of Ann Arbor just approved ranked choice voting for city council and mayor, et cetera. And I'm not quite sure how if they need to amend the state legislation, if that has to be approved. I'm not sure if that's true or not. But anyway, they did approve ranked choice voting there. So ranked choice voting, exhaustive primary, or range voting. So I'm going to have you can pick one of those. I'm going to ask you to explain it. And then I'm going to ask you, what's one advantage and what's one disadvantage of these things. Okay, so go back to your notes, look up, pick one of these things, have it well known. It's not that if you just pick ranked choice, it doesn't mean that you don't have to know about any of the others, because I'll have some multiple choice questions on that, or true-false questions. But I want you to be able to understand at least one of these methods and the ability to explain it to somebody else, okay? So pick one of those, explain what it is, explain what's a benefit with it. Maybe one of the costs might be, it might be subject to strategic voting, or, we talked about that. So that will be one of the questions. So make sure you know that one. I'm going to have another 10 points. So this will be a 10-pointer. And then another 10-point question is I'm going to ask you about proportional representation. And I'm going to want you to tell me why you might want to have proportional representation. We talked about the fact that you could have, let's say the Republicans could lose by 10 votes in all 435 congressional districts, and then they don't have any representation in the Congress, right? So I mean, that's sort of why, an explanation of why you might have proportional representation. And I want you to be able to explain the single transferable vote. Now, you can look over your notes. We lectured on it. There's also the 2 articles on single transferable vote. The one that I pointed out says that it's hard to explain, that one. So anyway, go ahead and be able to explain to your parents or something, somebody else that doesn't really know about it, how a single transferable vote works. So say why you might want to have proportional voting, and then explain the single transferable vote. Doesn't mean you shouldn't know the greatest remainder or the greatest average, right? Those I could put a multiple choice true false question on greatest remainder or greatest average. Those are the other 2 ways that we looked at proportional representation. And then a third essay question. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a payoff matrix, and this is where I'll put, let's say I'll put the pitcher here, and I'll put hitter up here, right? And then I'll give you some, pitcher at the curveball, fastball, hitter at the curve, and fastball. I'll put some, just put some numbers up here, maybe some, random. Maybe I'll have 40, 20. And, let's say pitcher, hitter, fastball, pitcher, curve, I'll put 10 and 60 or something like that, right? So I'll put some numbers in the table, and then what I'm going to want you to do, I'm going to want you to be able to convert this into the picture, the diagram, right? So where, I would have, if the pitchers at the, and I'll tell you whether that's the pitch from the pitcher's point of view is the pitcher's going from curveball to fastball. So I'm going to say, suppose that you can have a mixed strategy, and I want you to convert that mixed strategy payoff into equations. I'll ask you to do the diagram for sure, okay? So this is where if we had, let's say, I make it the pitcher going from curve to fastball. And then what you did was, well, when the pitcher's at the curve, okay, and the hitter's at the curve, then the payoff is going to be 40. So if the pitcher's at the curve and the hitter's at the curve, we're going to have 40. And then this is what? Hitter at the curve. And if the pitcher's at the curve and the hitter's at the fastball, then it's going to be 10, right? So if the pitcher's at the curve and the hitter's at the fastball, right, it'd be 10. And then if the pitcher's at the fastball, you're over here, then you're going to have 20 and 60. And this was going to be fastball. So draw that one, okay? So you should be able to take a payoff matrix and convert it into a picture, right? Where I'm, in fact, I'll tell you exactly what I say. Convert the payoff matrix into a diagram that shows the expected return as the pitcher moves from a pure strategy of pitching the curveball to a pure strategy of pitching the fastball, okay? All right? And then I'm going to ask you about what's the minimax theorem, right? The minimax theorem is that the maximum of the minimum. What is the pitcher trying to do? The pitcher's trying to minimize the maximum, and so that assumes the hitter's going to be going like that, right? And then there's going to be the optimal amount that, and so I'm going to say what is the I want you to draw the diagram, and then I want you to give me what the optimal strategy is, right? So remember how we did where you could, if you took the difference between these, right, 30, this would be 30 and 40, and then it would go, 3/7 over here and 4/7 over there, and you do the same thing down here. Remember I gave you that shortcut on how to do that. So I'm going to ask you to tell me what the optimal strategy is for the pitcher and the optimal strategy for the You do the same thing over here. Remember to get the optimal strategy for the hitter. So I'm going to ask you to tell me, take that payoff matrix, draw the diagram, be able to tell me what the optimal strategy is. And then you'll notice that on some of the old questions, I asked you to be able to write the equation down. And so the equation, write the equation for the two lines there. And so what is that? That's going to be x times something plus 1 minus x times something. This is going to be for the hitter, and that's going to be, we're going to have x question plus 1 minus x times that. So I'll ask you to I'll give you an extra credit question where you're going to write the equation that gives the payoff when the hitter anticipates the fastball and the pitcher's going from 0 to 100% on the fastball, and the equation that gives the payoff when the hitter anticipates the curve and the pitcher increases the percentage as the goes from curve to fastball. So remember that we did that. You can plug in the numbers there. So go back, go over your notes, and be able to, again, that's going to be an extra credit. I don't know how many extra credit points I'm going to give you. 30 extra credit points or something like that. So you should be able to do that. And then I'm going to, so what did I say? You're going to do the voting scheme, which is either going to be ranked choice, exhaustive primary, or range voting. You're going to do the proportional representation, be able to tell me how the single transferable vote works, be able to convert a payoff matrix into the optimal mixed strategy for the pitcher, or I could do it with the hitter, but it's the same idea. And so that'll be 30 of the 40 points in the essay questions. Probably one of the 5-point essay questions, I'm going to ask you just a simple thing on rent seeking, where I'm just going to ask you to tell me what rent seeking is and what is Gordon Tullock's point about rent seeking. That is, you use up that the rent seeking is where you use the government to try to give yourself an advantage. What was Tullock's point was that you'd use up resources in order to gain the rent, and the amount of resources that you'd use up, you look at the expected value from the bill passing or the rent seeking being successful, look at what the cost of it is, and you'll use up resources up to the amount of the expected return from your rent seeking being successful. Okay, so so what is that? That creates an inefficiency, and you've got resources being used up in the process of rent seeking rather than producing goods and services. So it's not just a zero-sum game. I gain, if I'm the U.S. steel manufacturers, I gain what the Chinese steel manufacturers lose, but resources are used up. Okay, so that would be like a five-point question. Okay, so any questions on that? Okay, so when you walk in there on Monday, you're not going to be surprised. Okay, so over the weekend or whatever, explain it to your roommate or explain it to someone, and also, again, there's only a limited amount of time, so come into it not going, oh yeah, I know how to answer that question. Okay. Make sure that you have, written it out, and so that you've, got an outline in your brain how you're going to answer the question. Okay, good on that. Okay, so that way I won't have to take very much time grading. It's possible the other 5-point question. I might do something on bureaucracy because we're going to almost finish that. We'll certainly have finished that by Friday. I might have a little 5-point thing on bureaucracy, or I might have a 5-point thing on prisoner's dilemma. and what we talked about prisoner's dilemma being where you have a dominant strategy and the other person has a dominant strategy, and yet the payoff from both of us pursuing our dominant strategy is less than if we both cooperated. And so what might you do? You might form a government in order to enforce the cooperative strategy, right? So if that would be the type of question that I might ask if I don't ask a question on bureaucracy. It would be a question on why we are justifying the use of government when markets are Pareto optimal, in a competitive, and the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. We argued, why do you need government? And we did it on the first part of the exam, or the first part of the class. In the game theory section here, we talked about prisoner's dilemma in particular as a mechanism where you might use government in order to enforce a cooperative strategy. All right, so review session tomorrow. If you're work through some of this stuff and you can't figure it out or you have a problem, make sure you bring it up at the review session. Okay. Any questions? There, good to go. All right. Okay. Last time we were looking at bureaucracies, and we noted that there's we have a bureau oftentimes when there's a problem in being able to define what the output is, and then we noted that there's basically a pervasive sort of ethical idea that there are certain things that you don't want to have the private sector earning profit on, like defense. Right? We do have company, BlackRock is a company that we've used in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places where it's a private company that provides defense. But probably the average person sort of looks askance at those sorts of things. And so we tend to have these things produced by the government, and the government normally would produce these things using a bureaucracy if they do it themselves. And we noted that when they could contract out, but there's oftentimes difficulty in defining what the output is, or having the ability to enforce to write out the contract. Again, you might go ahead and take a look at both rent-seeking and bureaucracy, right? Have chapters in Holcomb's book, so go ahead and take a little look at that. If there are advances in the ability to write contracts, like if people come up with innovative ideas, so if you get innovation in contracting or defining the output, then what you could do is that would lead to more outsourcing to the private sector. That is, I could hire companies to provide the service. Let's say that there's a difference, we said, between government provision of the service and government production of the service. So you might want to have public education. You might say, okay, we think that the government ought to be providing this stuff. Doesn't mean it's going to produce it through a bureaucratic Department of Education. Okay, it might be that you just contract out with private firms or give people vouchers, and then they go out and buy their education, wherever they want in terms of private schools. So I might be more willing to hire a private company to run my charter school if we have a mechanism to figure out how we're going to write that into the contract and how we're going to measure what the output's going to be, right? So there might be, you figure out tests that figure out, the improvement Maybe you're going to pay you based on the improvement that the students make from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, or things like that. So if there's mechanisms to try to figure out how to measure the output, then it'll be easier to have private firms produce the thing. The government hires them, and they actually do the production. Bureaus tend to focus on measurable inputs rather than the output. Sort of think about it. What do they often do? They focus on measurable inputs rather than outputs. Listen to Governor Whitmer talking about education, right? K-12 education, or improving the education in Detroit public schools or whatever. They're going to talk about how much you spend, right? She's going to say, oh, we need to spend more money, okay? That's how we're going to measure how we're improving Detroit public schools, or how much we're improving public schools in Michigan. How much are we spending on education? You'll never see her talk about, oh, we want to make sure that these national test scores have gone up by 5% or something like that, right? So they bureaus tend to focus on the inputs rather than the output. Another sort of, and I'm mentioning these sort of comments on the idea of bureaus. Another comment that might make is that oversight committees So, for example, let's say the Department of Agriculture is being overseen by the House Agricultural Committee or something like that, that the oversight committees, then they tend to be staffed by those who are interested in larger expenditures. By those interested in larger expenditures. Or output, depending if it's some sort of measurable thing. So if you look at the congressional committee that is overseeing the agricultural department, who's going to be on it, right? Who are they going to appoint to be on that committee? Well, it's probably going to be some congressperson that's from an a rural district. Somebody that's really interested in agriculture. That's who's likely to be sitting on that oversight committee. You're probably not going to have the congressperson from New York City be sitting on the agricultural committee, overlooking what the Department of Agriculture does, right? So that's going to lead you to bureaus are going to be spending more money than it might otherwise be. And so another comment is, what are the incentive problems? Right? In the sense of, how do I give an incentive for you, the director of the Department of Health and Human Services, or the Secretary of Agriculture, how do I give an incentive for you to perform, right? How to give an incentive for the bureaucrat to perform. As I said, when I was Deputy State Treasurer, how in the world was I going to give some sort of incentive to the person that is in charge of the income tax for me? How am I going to make it so that they have an incentive to do a really good job, right? Pretty hard. I'll tell you the truth, I wasn't even thinking about it, right? And if you look at how your salaries are actually structured, you probably have an incentive to want to have your department bigger and bigger. the larger your department, then the more, more your salary's probably going to go up. So, what's a problem here is that you can't, if you can't measure the output, that's part of this, right? How am I gonna get this incentive for you to perform in a good measure? So again from Econ 105, what did Mises talk about in liberalism, right? When he was talking about bureaus, he said that in the private sector you've got profit. We already talked about this, right? If I'm the vice president of Ford Motor Company for North American operations, I got a measure that says, okay, we're losing money in North America. I got an idea that this bureaucrat here is not doing as good a job as they might otherwise do. Whereas there's no there's no profit signal, right? Then that's what Mises pointed out, is there's no profit signal in the public sector as there is in the private sector. So what does that mean? The compensation is going to be related. Compensation is going to be related to something other than profit. Because I'm not making a profit in the Department of Health and Human Services. And so this is an interesting example. The Soviet Union, I mean, you guys aren't old enough to remember the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union was a centrally planned state, and it had all sorts of bureaucrats. So they're in charge of just a sort of interesting, simple thing is nails. Okay? So let's think about the Soviet Union. And they got to produce nails, right? If you're going to build a house or fix lots of things, you need a nail. So how many nails should you make? And how well are you doing as the person that's in charge of making nails? Well, the first thing they did was they compensated a bureaucrat, based on tons of nails. Right? So they got an output measure, tons of nails. Guess what? What do you think they got? Big nails. Right? So I'll make if I'm just producing tons of nails, what I want to do, I want to have big nails there, right? So then they said, oops, that didn't work out so well. So what we're going to now do is we're going to produce it based on the number of nails. So, okay, change. Guess what happened? Lots of small nails, right? So just as a simple example of the difficulties in trying to run through things through a bureau. How do you get people who are the bureaucrats? How do you get them to perform in an efficient manner, right? It's hard to do. And so what did Adam Smith said that in Wealth of Nations? He said, think back to Adam Smith. He argued that you ought to reward bureaucrats based on their performance, right? But what's the problem here? He said, okay, how many have read Wealth of Nations? Anybody? Really? Okay. Just as an aside, I had a book, the Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and in the old days, you used to be able to get books on tape, and you'd stick them in your cassette player when you're driving your car. And so I was driving up drove to Lansing or something with my wife, and my wife falls asleep whenever we're driving. She falls asleep, so I put that in the cassette player, and I'm listening to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and she sort of wakes up in the middle, and he's talking about guilders, right? And she wakes up and she thinks it's the news, and so she's going, why in the world are we talking about guilders in the news? So, no, we're listening to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. But anyway, in Wealth of Nations, what he talks about, he says we're going to reward based on performance. But what's the problem here, right? How to measure. I mean, that's sort of the that's the problem. Theoretically, we'd like to reward you in the same fashion that we reward a bureaucrat in the private sector based on how well you perform, but it's difficult to measure how what the performances are. Another comment is that if they're performing poorly and there are, in some sense, if there are losses from the performance of a bureaucrat, where do those losses show up? Those losses show up that diffuse through the population, right? Those losses are, in a sense, diffused through the citizenry, right? Not borne by the bureaucrat, right? So the bureaucratic way of doing things doesn't work out particularly well in the sense that how can that be an efficient use of resources? Okay, so again, if you have a problem and there's an overuse of a particular service, that we're producing too much of it, where the return to the populace in general is less than the costs that are being imposed through taxes or whatever. That is being borne by all you folks out there, you taxpayers, but not by the bureaucrat themselves. And so it is difficult to find ways to provide an incentive for the bureaucrat to perform efficiently. Now, if you're the bureaucrat, remember that we noted that in defining what a bureau was, we said that you don't appropriate the difference between the revenues and the costs as salary to you or income to you. But how do you go about doing that? Well, right, you get a big office, right? Or you get a higher salary for yourself, right? You try and convince let's say you're the assistant secretary for Health and Human Services. You try to convince the secretary for Health and Human Services that you work really hard and that you ought to get a raise, or like I said, you get big offices, or you get a car, right? You can think of all sorts of ways that you as a bureaucrat could increase your increase not necessarily your salary, but increase what your benefits are. Maybe you get a larger insurance policy or things like that as a mechanism to try to garner some of this excess spending that's going to be happening. Now, Bill Niskanen. Remember that we said that a lot of the early discussions about bureaucracy was done by sociologists and political scientists. William Niskanen, who actually was one of my thesis advisors when I was at Berkeley, one of the things that he sort of became famous for was looking at bureaucracies. And what he noted was that who's really the customer? This is William Niskanen. He said that the customer of the bureaucrat is really the legislator. That is, if you are let's say you're Betsy DeVos and she's Secretary of Education, okay? and Betsy was Secretary of Education, and she goes in and what the Congress wants that. Why do you have a Department of Education, right? Because the Congress thinks that the federal government ought to be doing things in education. So, who is then Betsy going to say, hey, we can produce this much education, or we can provide these educational services? Who is she selling that to, right? She's not selling it to you guys, right? She's selling it to the Congress. She's selling it to the legislature. And so the customer, in a sense, the customer of the bureaucrat is the legislator. They're going to the legislator and saying, hey, we can produce this much education. Here's what it's going to cost, okay? So the legislator is providing the funding, and in general, bureaus are in general a monopoly provider to the legislator, right? So they're one way to look at this is you're a monopoly provider to the legislator. And therefore, what's going on is that I'm going to say, here's how many services that we can provide for a given budget. This is the amount of service for a given budget. And Niskanen then talks about this in a book that he wrote in 1971, which is called Bureaucracy and Representative Democracy. That's sort of what's made him famous. Bureaucracy and Representative Democracy, 1971. And Niskanen goes in there and in this book, and then he later on has some other articles, of course, one of which I put in the folder, the subfolder in 415 is an article that he wrote in 1975. But anyway, what he says is that, okay, let's say that what's the model here? We're going to use economic theory and it's sort of this economic analysis to say, okay, what's the incentives and what are these people trying to do? And so what he says is, let's assume that the bureaucrat is trying to what? Maximize the size of the budget. Okay? That's the assumption. If you are the Secretary of Agriculture, what are you trying to do? If you are using economic way of thinking and saying, okay, what are you trying to do? You're trying to maximize utility. What would you try to do? You try to maximize the size of your budget. And why would that be? Because if you have a larger budget, what are you going to get? You're going to get a larger office. You're going to get a car. You're going to get to fly around the country. You're going to get to do all sorts of things if you have a larger budget. So Niskanen assumes then that what's going on is the bureaucrat is trying to maximize the size of the budget. And the other big assumption is that, we'll put here, and then that the bureaucrat knows more. The bureaucrat knows more about the cost of providing the service than the legislator. So this is the sort of these 2 points here is the major the major assumptions of the model that Niskanen said. So he says, okay, what are bureaucrats trying to do, right? Let's assume that they're rational individuals like this trying to make themselves better off. What would you like to do? You'd like you'd rather be the director in charge of a very large budget with all sorts of things going on. So CNN's interviewing you, and you got a driver to drive you around, and you got a nice big office, and you get paintings by famous artists hung up in your office and that kind of stuff, right? If you just have a tiny little budget, right, you're off here in a little, what are you going to be? You're going to be living in, living like a refugee over here in this, little corner office somewhere with no windows and that kind of stuff, right? So that makes some sort of sense to say, yeah, bureaucrats, what are they trying to do? They're trying to maximize the size of the budget. And you got this asymmetric information issue here. That is, you know more about what it costs to, let's say, provide for agricultural services. You're going to have people to go out from the Department of Agriculture, going to have to go out and inspect, farmland or, do that kind of thing. You know more about how much it costs to produce these agricultural services than does the legislator. So because you have this asymmetric information, and we assume that the bureaucrat knows the demand of the legislator. Okay? So I'm the bureaucrat. I'm trying to make my budget as large as possible. I know what the legislator, that congressional committee, what their demand curve looks like. How many services are they willing to, would they be willing to buy at a certain amount of the cost, okay, whatever the budget's going to be. And so if you just did a Rod Stewart here, and every picture tells a story. So if what we do is we draw a picture of that, we have the idea that this is the Scanlon's idea is here's the demand curve for the legislators. Okay, so we have dollars here, this is the amount, and this is the quantity of service. And let's suppose, just to make things simple, let's suppose that there's a constant marginal cost providing extra services from the Department of Agriculture. We could draw this let's say this is the long run marginal cost and it's equal to then the long run average cost. We're assuming constant marginal cost. Suppose it goes like this, again, just to make the picture easier to draw. Okay? But the idea is going to be the same even if the long run marginal cost is increasing. But so if we look at this, and let's just, I'll do we have 0, P, and A up here, where this comes here, and we'll have X2, that's the amount of the quantity of services out there, and this is D. And so if we take a look at that, if you were to maximize the benefit to the legislators, okay, where would you go? You'd go to X2, right? So X2 would maximize the benefit to the legislators, right? And what is the area under the demand curve is the total benefit, right? And the total cost then of producing Q2 X2 of producing X2 is going to be that rectangle, right? It's going to be 0, P, D, X2. And the benefit then is 0, A, D, X2, right? The area under the demand curve. So the benefit is equal to 0, A, D, X2, right? And so the triangle, right, A, P, D, right, that's their net benefit, right? So if I were trying to maximize the situation for the legislature, what would I do? I'd go in, and I'm the bureaucrat, I'd say, okay, here's what the long run marginal costs are, here's how much it's going to cost to produce this amount of agricultural services, and the amount of agricultural services that maximizes the net benefit for the legislators would be where the long-run marginal cost is equal to where the demand curve crosses, right? That's the marginal benefit to the legislators. Now, that's not what the bureaucrat wants to do, right? What did we just say? The bureaucrat's trying to maximize the size of the budget. And if the bureaucrat knows more about the demand curve for the legislator than the legislator knows about that cost curve, what are you going to try to do? You're going to try to push it this direction, okay? And then the thing is, where could you go to? Let's just put x3, okay? Suppose you offer x3, okay? So you can go beyond, so you're increasing the amount of the output, okay, or the services beyond what is the optimal amount from the legislator's perspective. And what will happen is that how far can you go, okay? This will be accepted because the legislature doesn't know how much it's really going to cost to produce that service. How far out can you go, right? You could go until what happens? Until we'll call this C, until DCD is equal to a PD. Well, what are we saying? We're just saying that as long as this amount ends up with a total equal to 0, right? If you, how far could you actually get, right? You could go beyond the maximum as long as you get to the point where they say, hey, no, we're not going to do that, right? We're not going to do it at all. Because now what's going on is they have a negative net benefit. So what Niskanin's point is that the maximizing bureaucrat will, they have the advantage and they know more about what it costs to produce the good than the legislators do. And they know what the demand for the legislator looks like. If you really maximize the budget, what could you do? You could push it out until that triangle was just equal to that triangle. That's as far as you could get, right? Certainly if this triangle were less than that triangle, they'd say, okay, I got a net benefit from this amount, let's do it, right? And so Niskanin's model just basically says, I've got, what do bureaucrats try to do? Bureaucrats try to maximize the size of their budget. They know more about the demand that the legislator has than does the legislator know about what it costs to produce those services. You're a member of the House Agriculture Committee. You don't really know how much it costs to provide to, so many agricultural, advisees to the farmers or whatever. And so that you will be able to push that, push the size of the budget. You'll be able to push out the amount beyond what is the optimal amount from the legislator's point of view. All right, it's next time for Friday, what we'll do is we're going to do, Wagner's got a little criticism of Niskanin's model here, and that will finish bureaucracy. We're pretty well done with that. And then we'll start taking a look at rational ignorance. So you might want to take a look at the section on rational ignorance. Review session tomorrow night. Take a look at, have the answers outlined for those questions that I gave you. Those are going to be the essay questions on the midterm.